I do think we are in a moment of chaos. I think that's kind of indisputable.
You can't keep up and you can't navigate it.
Trump's disrupting and chaotic on purpose.
Why are our cultural stories feeling so uncertain at the moment?
That is adding to the chaos because we're not sure what to believe. We're not sure what news we're getting fed.
Who do we look for to bring order out of chaos? Are we looking to ourselves or are we looking to the Spirit of God?
It doesn't really matter what you want to call it. I don't really care, but what I do think we can all agree on is there's a deep problem here. It's both personal and it's collective, and therefore we're trying to respond.
Hello and welcome. My name is Jo Frost, here with my co-host Peter Lynas. This is Being Human. We are back for season 6. Last season we were exploring the Being Human lens and how it helps us see the storylines and how they're impacting and shaping our being human in this world, who we are and how we live. This season, Peter, we're going to do things a little bit differently. What's the plan?
We're looking at kind of like what's happening. I like to say the vibe shift. You will roll your eyes.
Check it out on YouTube. There was a definite roll.
Yes, you need to go on YouTube to see the facial expressions that add extra colour to this whole podcast. We are going through that arc again. What are the cultural stories saying? They are shifting incredibly fast. What's the problems that are down there? What are the problems that we all share, regardless of where we sit in those cultural stories? So we're going deep and trying to identify those problems and then saying, what does the God story help to say to help us respond to that? How do we actually navigate that? What does that look like for you and I in these conversations? And then, as always, we are going to keep pushing into these practices. How do we actually respond? What are the habits and practices that we build into our lives in response to these situations? So we're not picking a topic, an individual issue like we did before. We are going wide into the big story conversation.
Can't wait. So this week we are looking at culture in chaos. And once again, Peter, you have a ridiculous word that you like to use when we're having this conversation. What's this one?
Well, chaosity is the state that we find ourselves in. Although I was at an event recently where permacrisis and polycrisis were used by a number of speakers, and I felt vindicated for using them previously. Because I do think we are in a moment of chaos. I think that's kind of indisputable. That's why we're here. It doesn't matter whether you're on the left, the right, you're young, you're old, where you are in the world, it is pretty chaotic out there. And pretty much everybody says that.
Nice. They just don't use the word chaosity.
Even you agree. You and I even agree on this one. That might be the only part we agree on this podcast, but we do agree we're in a moment of chaos. And that has come to the fore. Like, we haven't been doing this podcast for a few months now, and the scale of change is incredible. You can point to Trump as the individual, but actually beneath that, I think there's way more going on. It's way more than just Trump. If Trump dropped dead, there's no other way to put it tomorrow, it would still be a moment of chaos and change. Musk is sitting in behind that and the tech bros. You've got the AfD in Germany and the rise of the right, the far right, the alt-right. There's lots of different ways, and the whole argument, even as to the label there, reform in the UK, now out polling both the Conservatives and Labour. Now it's in between elections. It doesn't mean they would win an election, but the scale of their polling is significant. And the National Rally in France. Those are just to name 3 countries off the top.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely true to say that it still feels very chaotic out there. I mean, we published Being Human end of 23. We
have a book. We should tell people about that.
Check it out. All good bookshops, and some bad ones. So Being Human came out end of 23. We'd been writing that for a while. And even in those spaces, we were talking about being in spaces of crisis, of uncertainty, and of chaos. And now we have a Trump presidency that is definitely upending some of the geopolitical spaces. But the chaos isn't just a political one. It's coming at us from loads of different spaces. I mean, the technological space would be a place that you would love to push around and explore. What does the chaos of AI and different forms of technology that are developing and shifting and changing the landscape, changing the rules of play, what do they do to how we understand ourselves, each other, and the world that we live in?
Yeah, and again, speed of change there is just phenomenal. Like, so you had ChatGPT, everybody talking about it. You've now got Grok, which is Musk's kind of linked with X and Twitter. And they are rewriting the rules. You've got artists saying they're not going to produce any more content because it's being ripped. You've got different governments trying to legislate around that. You've got filmmaking, book writing, news provision. I mean, somebody wrote a book recently and said, no AI was used in this book. And I was like, I suspect you can't claim that if you Googled a single thing. So I know what the person was trying to do, but it's probably not true despite their best intents. Information sharing, I mean, the list is endless as to where AI is beginning. And so again, that is adding to the chaos because we're not sure what to believe. We're not sure what news we're getting fed, the summaries we're getting, things that we have talked about before. And it has real world implications because some of the stuff that's happened, you've got JD Vance at the Munich Security Conference making speeches. But the reality is this is very real for Ukraine. This is very real for Russia. This is very real in Israel and in Gaza and in Palestine. The things that are being proposed have incredibly significant implications in the real world. How we fight those battles, how we talk about them. You had a recent UN Security Council vote on the anniversary of the Ukraine invasion in which Russia, Belarus and North Korea were all on the same side. No surprise, all essentially opposing. But the USA was on the same side as those three in a vote in the UN. It's just inconceivable even a few months ago. And so the shifts and the real world implications of those shifts are massive. And even internally, Bannon and Musk are not on the same side. If you think of somebody like Trump, they detest each other. Jordan Bordell, who's the head of the French kind of far-right party, cancelled going to an event with Bannon at it. So internally inside each side, the left and the Democratic side, post the US elections, are tearing themselves apart, working out which side should be dominant. There's no coherent narrative in the sides, let alone between the sides. So there's layers and layers and layers to this chaos, I would say. We're all experiencing it.
So if we take a step back for a second, so you've just talked about all these big names that we're hearing on the political stage as the Trump presidency doesn't even find its feet. It just starts ramping up and sprawling all over the place. One of the political commentators I was hearing was that is by design to be so fast and change the conversation so quickly in so many different areas. You can't keep up and you can't navigate it. It is chaotic by order. So what do we mean by chaos? Why are we talking about it? What is its significance? Why are our cultural stories feeling so uncertain at the moment? Let's take a step back and just go, what do we mean by this and why are we looking at it?
So a great question. And I'll go first, but I'd really like to hear them what you want to say on that, because I think there's a disruption aspect that is sometimes healthy. There's a kind of more revolutionary end of that. Things need to change. There were problems. There were things that need to be addressed. So the tech bros in particular, and that's what they're called, were move fast and break stuff, and that was kind of their mantra. And some of that has come into government, and some of that has come into lots of other spaces. And then there is the chaos, almost by design, of somebody like Putin who likes chaos because the strong man, the order, sort of thrives into the chaos. You come as the Ubermensch, and you are the kind of hero who solves the chaos. So some of that is a desire and a deliberate chaos. And David Brooke at an event I was at some time ago was just saying about conservatives conserve things. Trump's not a conservative, whatever you think of his political views. He is disrupting and chaotic on purpose. And some of that is constant distraction. Some of that is necessary. He says we need to get rid of systems that were just deeply flawed and deeply bad. And personally, I think part of the problem is that all of those things are true. And that's part of it. So there were things that did need changed up pretty quickly. But in the process, you wreck long-held institutions that actually held value and did something useful. And so there is disruption that is required, and there's chaos by design that is destabilizing. It's essentially designed to destabilize people, and then they want the stable thing that is the strong man. And so Trump comes through and says, I'll solve this for you. And all of those things seem to be happening at once, which is difficult to process, I think.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think I often associate chaos with order. As an antithesis of each other. So if you find one space to be quite ordered, you'll find another space to be quite chaotic. So at the moment, I get to celebrate our new studio in our offices. I won't be here every time because I probably can't get in here every time, but it looks very nice. If you're on YouTube, I have a lovely setup. If you turn the camera around, you would see a very disordered reality of cables and things propped up on books and hidden away and shoved out of corner, because actually, for a lot of the time, order feels quite precarious. It doesn't feel necessarily very safe. And so this idea of chaos is an idea of instability. It's the idea of uncertainty, and it's a lack of predictability. And ultimately, it's a lack of control. There's an issue of power here. Who can have authority and bring order out of chaos? So like you were saying with Putin, he likes setting up a chaotic world so that he can impose his power and his authority and bring order to control it. Trump loves bringing chaos so that he isn't controlled and people can't control him because he is too unpredictable. So for me, the conversation around chaos, we can look at it at a really big level. You can look at it on the geopolitical space. You can look at it at the technological space, but you can also feel it really personally. You can feel it in your communities where there's a lot of movement. There's people coming into cities, people leaving rural settings. We saw in the COVID lockdowns, people moving back to greener, more suburban, more rural spaces because they wanted more space. There's a lot of movement. You've got it in the migration conversations as the demographics of spaces change. That creates a sense of disorder and uncertainty. People don't know what the rules of engagement are. If you've ever been on holiday to a different culture, you can walk into a shop or a public space and go, I don't know what I'm supposed to do here. And that can feel really unsettling. We really like order, we like control, and we like to have authority over the places that we're in. And yet we live in a society and a culture that doesn't facilitate that very well.
Absolutely. And so I think the implications are, we've talked about the mental health crisis before, and I think that's one of them, very, anchoring this back into the real world. And, some polling recently about young people. So Gen Z, 13 to 27-year-olds, the Times reported this, 52% thought the UK would be a better place if a strong leader was in charge who does not bother with parliament or elections. Because people are like, I don't know what to do, but that's a staggering idea that's a solution. Or a third said we'd be better off if the army was in charge, and almost half the entire way our society is organised must be radically changed through revolution.
There's that scene in season 2 of Fleabag, right before things get very inappropriate, that she's in the confessional booth and she is confessing that she wants somebody to tell her what to do. And there's this heartbreaking moment where she just says, because I think I'm getting it wrong. And there's this moment in that confession where she's, I don't bring order. I don't bring stability. I am not predictable. That when I am left to my own decision making, I make the wrong decision. I need somebody to tell me what to do because I can't be trusted to do it for myself. And I think there's a real human honesty in that scene that says, actually, when I look at myself, I make really bad decisions and I bring more chaos than I bring order, and I don't like it. And that's not how I want to live.
Absolutely. And I think the chaos order motif, the thing we're riffing off, is something we've riffed off before because we are pulling it from the biblical story. Because we've watched people like Jordan Peterson, one of the people who narrates this space, do something very similar. And people have various views on what exactly he's doing. But basically, he's narrated the world outside is chaotic. And what we need to do is bring order. Sometimes 12 rules for living, sometimes getting up at the same time each day, getting your breakfast, things like that. That was his original book that brought him to the fore. He has continued to engage around faith, and he has looked at these Genesis stories as we have and said, hey, this is exactly at the core of that story. There was the tohu vabohu. It's my best attempt at the Hebrew there, the watery chaos. No, that's it, done. People can go back and listen. That's it. I've massacred the Hebrew language once there. And it pulls from and draws from these ideas. The Babylonian myth, the Enuma Elish. And I remember when I first was at Bible college, learning about this and thinking, why am I learning about these other things? The Bible has the story. What do I need? And it's just actually other cultures had narratives like this, but it's actually the distinctives of what they were doing. In their epic, Marduk, the chief god, battles with Tiamat, defeats her and brings order out of chaos, but then cuts her body in two for land and water, makes human beings to serve him and the other gods. And it's the distinctiveness of what God does in this moment out of the watery chaos. He does call forth order in speech acts, the importance of speech in this moment, the importance of how we narrate our way into the world, creates human beings as the highest. Of course, we're going to say that as the kind of pinnacle, or at least the end point of the creation story, and says they are made in the image of God. And so we want to anchor ourselves into that story in contrast to what has always been. So in one sense, it was ever thus. There has always been chaos, and the biblical story has always called order out of the chaos, life out of the kind of darkness and the emptiness, because it's not simply a story of order. I don't want to say, hey, it's organized religion, that's the solution. In fact, that's not at all what we want to say. But there is an aspect of that we see in the biblical story.
Because I think there has always been chaos. And that's what Genesis 1 really clearly says. But there's always been this desire for us to control our chaos, for us to bring order. We've seen that time and time again, solutions that we come up with to solve the problem of chaos, whether it was modernity, whether it was science, whether it was the Enlightenment, whether it was progressivism, whether it was organized religion, whether it's populism as the new solution that's coming through. No ism has ever been capable of overcoming the human condition that we do not bring order out of chaos. We are part of the chaotic, disordered space. It is when God's Spirit moves that order comes. And we see that when the Holy Spirit is hovering over the waters in Genesis 1. And we see it again when we find Jesus speaking, as you said, the speech act, over the waters in Mark, where he calms the storm. And once again, we are seeing the authority that God has to bring order out of chaos and how we are subjected to his ordering power. But we cannot do it on our own. And every time we do, we notice how much we fail, whether it's in our personal life, trying to follow Jordan Peterson's 12 rules for life, or ordering our Tupperware, or changing our political persuasions because the next person seems to have the solutions to the problems that we're facing. We will see the same repeats of history, because when we try to bring order, we will fail. But when we see and partner with God's ordering project, something completely different can happen.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of challenges that we see as I think for us as Christians, trying to narrate the God story in an age of information overload. One of the things we did was reject the overarching story and say we don't need that. But then we're just faced with literally thousands of pieces of information coming at us, and we can't process them, and so we do find it overwhelming. One is, I think at the moment, some people talk about what is this moment and what's going on. Part of it is that we can actually hold a level of chaotic incoherence. We hold ideas that are ultimately conflict if we thought about them. We just hold these various bits of information separately. And so that is challenging, I think, as Christian leaders, as people who want to disciple in this moment, who want to talk about it. People are able to hold more incoherence than they have before, in an unhealthy way, I think. I think another challenge then is that Christianity is often seen as a useful tool. There's a sense we're in some sort of civilizational decline, some sort of moment of change, and all we need to do is go back to what was, and some of that was shaped by Christianity, and there's some positives and some negatives, but most people at this moment say, oh, well, the positives, can we have those, please? But without, essentially want the God story, but without the God of that story. The kingdom without the king, some of that. And there are two different ways that can spin out. But fundamentally, in this moment, it's more, let's have those bits of cultural Christianity. Even Richard Dawkins saying you might be a cultural Christian. But others exploring that space, talking about Christianity. But they don't, to me, seem always, and again, careful not to make a judgment, but I'm trying to see where is your deep encounter with Jesus? Where is the ultimate moment of accepting his grace and sacrifice? Where is the repentance in that moment? And where's the Holy Spirit? And the final thing that's linked to that, I think, is that, particularly with something like Peterson, the kind of Jungian psychology that's still a bit of pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. We can do this. The God story is useful.
But it's just a tool.
In fact, an event recently talked about our need for self-sacrifice, but said that this was the capstone the builders had rejected. Now, he might have been making a very deep pun that the self-sacrifice was that of Jesus, but I think he was talking about our own self-sacrifice into a bigger community, and saying, then he riffs a biblical pun to play with that, but doesn't seem to get that the very capstone was Jesus. That's the point, that we submit ourselves to the one who was crucified in this moment. And I do think that's a culturally really challenging story. People talk about being Christian. One of my old preaching profs used to say, do you worship Jesus? Do you fall at his feet? Which in a kind of more public environment, that's a jarring way to Yes, but that's not the way we tend to put it. Oh, I follow Jesus, I'm a Christian. No, do you worship? Do you fall down at his feet and call him Lord? And that's the challenge, I think, in this cultural moment.
Yes. We can even hear it in our own conversations. We do this all the time, that we look to Jesus as a model. And we do this in being human. We go, how does Jesus show us how to live? Can we do the things that he did? And we say, well, yes. And then we say, but Jesus is the answer. So when we fail, which we ultimately will do, then we go to Jesus for mercy and for grace and forgiveness. And then we just rinse, repeat. So we try to be like Jesus tomorrow. When we fail, we will get his grace and mercy back. There is something so much more profound about the idea that we fall at his feet and worship him, because we're recognizing that in his divinity, Jesus can do something that we can't. That there is a moment where in our humanity, we model what it means to follow Jesus and do what he did. But there is also a moment where he did what we could not do. He succeeded where we will always fail. And there is this moment where we look to Jesus to reorientate and reform us. And our discipleship comes back to him and him alone. We cannot adopt the tools of Christianity without worshipping the King of Christianity. And I think so many of the conversations that we're seeing around Christian values, Christian principles, Christian practices, if they are used that we are mimicking Jesus without recognizing the sovereignty of Jesus, we're just setting ourselves up to fail yet again.
100% agree. And this is going to be a very disappointing episode for most people who expect us to disagree, but we're in agreement.
Don't worry,
the
vibe shift is coming. Don't worry, it will change.
The vibe shift is coming. And I've hinted at an event that I was at, and it might be useful just to say a minute or two more as we think of those practices, because this is where for me, it landed a little bit. This ARC event, the Alliance of Responsible Citizenship.
I was not there.
You weren't there. I was. It's a gathering of 4,000 people. It was the weird and the wonderful coming together, exploring, essentially what does it mean to be a responsible citizen, and deep political engagement around that and the social fabric, and are we at a moment of civilizational decline, and do we need to rebuild the social fabric? And lots of interesting people. Jordan Peterson and then Baroness Philippa Stroud were kind of the co-hosts of the event. People like Oz Guinness and Amy R. Ewing participating, but also Peter Thiel and Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House in the US, and lots of others, including Nigel Farage. So it was the weirdest and most eclectic mix. But here's what's interesting. There was a desire to embrace, for me, what was interesting was the desire to embrace the Christian story, to talk about marriage, to talk about family, to talk about the beginning and end of life and some of those topics that are more difficult, to talk actually very openly from the stage about pornography, as in that it's a problem, and the desire to see that push back, and really interesting to see Room navigate some of these things. But there were these moments when there's a lovely guy, Johannes, I think Swedish guy, talking about prayer and grace, and Oz Guinness pushing about that Christianity as a tool, and some talk of forgiveness and mercy, and some interesting little moments. Joshua Luke Smith did a spoken word piece, a prophetic piece about sunflowers in Babylon. And you could see the moments where people were being pushed beyond the basic concept of Christianity as a useful idea to there's something more substantive in this. There's a fundamental reorientating of history around a person and a personal relationship, and it requires grace and mercy and forgiveness, and not simply cheap energy and a free market solution over here where the conference was weaker. But it did push into some of these questions. Maybe it could have done more, absolutely. But I think that it's that discipleship landing, particularly around grace and forgiveness and prayer in these moments. That's where people got a little less comfortable, maybe. But that, for me, is where this begins to land in the practices. It's like you were seeing people do discipleship in real time. I have no idea where Ian Hershey Ali was there, Neil Ferguson, Jordan Peterson, all of whom have made faith commitments or statements. And it's like they're doing their discipleship in real time. And that used to happen in private and go for a year or two before they come out. And now you're kind of like, oh, that's really interesting. Oh, that's quite provocative. That's not the way we'd normally frame it. Oh, that's just wrong. That might even be heresy. And it's weird to watch the discipleship. And we do need to build in the practices that are going to help people navigate this moment, which isn't always doing discipleship in real time, but it is some of the things that take us into the presence of Jesus. And in a sense, you're going to talk more on the presence this was a moment where people were trying to navigate what does it mean to follow Jesus in a very real, live political space with lots of different views. Certainly didn't always get it right, but I liked that it was a very open part of the conversation in a way that it hasn't always been.
I think it is fascinating, the public nature of some people's personal exploration of what it means to recognize that we are incapable of solving some of the problems that we're facing today. That we cannot bring peace, we cannot bring order, we don't bring control in chaotic times, and that no matter what model, no matter what tools, no matter what political system or politician we vote for next, we are still going to repeat the same challenges and the same problems. But there is one who does bring peace, who does speak order, who can transform chaotic spaces, because there is one who rules and reigns and brings light out of darkness and order over chaos. And so for me, this question around some of the Christian practices isn't a matter of adopting something to see if we can do what Jesus did, because if we do the same things that he did, then obviously we will have the same outcomes. For me, the practices are a moment of reorientation. We would talk about them in terms of being a reformation. So if the cultural stories form our humanity in some bent out of shape way, some disordered, chaotic way, how do the practices help us reform our humanity in an ordered way? And they are ordered by being reorientated and reformed around the person and the presence of Jesus. We have to work out how to practice living our lives as if Jesus is in charge of it, not me. And so there are two practices that we would love to suggest, or I would love to suggest, because I said, Peter, we should do these ones, when it comes to chaos. So my first...
So why did you suggest fasting? Yes, I'm curious about this one.
So my first one is fasting, which is always interesting because people often talk about fasting in conjunction with prayer. And we often talk about fasting in terms of intercession. If we want something to happen, we pray and fast about it. And it almost becomes a bit of a bargaining chip. It's our attempt to bring order, right? If I pray and fast about this situation, God is obliged, because I've sacrificed something, God is obliged to act in the way that I want him to. And personally, I think this is a complete misunderstanding of what fasting is. Fasting for me is this moment of relinquishing the illusion that we have control over our lives and over our bodies. Because the first thing that comes to the forefront when we fast food is that we realize that our hunger and our bellies and our bodies control us far more than we realized. Because of all of a sudden, I get hungry and I get grumpy because I'm hungry. My body expects me to feed it. Richard Foster talks about our hunger as being like a spoilt child because it gets what it wants whenever it demands it. So fasting is a matter of actually saying, I give my body nourishment and I pay attention to my body, and it controls my behavior in a lot of ways. But actually, man should not live by bread alone, but by the word of God. What does it mean for God to be responsible for nourishing not just our bodies, but our souls? And what does it mean when I recognize that I'm not in control often of my body and my appetites and my desires, but actually God can and should be in control of me? So fasting is another moment of reorientation, of putting God back in control over my soul, over my mind, and over my body, and saying, you bring order out of chaos, and I'm going to give myself over to you because it's all you anyway.
So I think that's really helpful. What I liked about it was this is about power and control at this moment. And I think that ability to break off and to reassert, to reorientate, to reform in this moment, I do think is critically important, because so much of the current narrative is who's got power and control in this situation. And whether we like it or not, we're on the receiving end of that, and we're being shaped, and we're being shaped by a whole series of stories. And some of them even like I feel like with a lot of friends talking, oh, this is really interesting. It's sort of Christian. This is kind of interesting. And even then, you just have that ability to step back, that ability to be really careful about our own appetites and desires. My only slight contrary kind of thought is, I can't believe I'm going to suggest hospitality versus you in this. And I'm not fully, because I think you're too right, but that the flip side of the fasting is the feasting and the ability to gather and to sit with those with different views. And the reality is, if you sit with anybody at the minute, they have a different view, because there's no way we all align on everything. You know, the splits within the old camps are there, and they are only going to grow. The one we mentioned earlier, the kind of Bannon Musk, within Trump's world, there are at least two major camps. That's going to blow up. Like in all spaces, that's also true. You see the right here in the UK, the Conservatives and Reform. It doesn't matter which party affiliation, church group, there are these things growing. So our ability to sit together. But I think you're right on the appetites and desires piece. And I think your second one also takes us into that desires and appetites piece, because so much of this is about the orientation and the desiring piece and how we reset that in a world of kind of information overload.
Yes. So the third practice, if we're going to let hospitality sneak in, and I'm never going to say no to hospitality.
It's a little 1B.
Yeah. I'm never going to say no to hospitality as a practice that we should practice. Is this question of who do we look for to bring order out of chaos? Are we looking to ourselves? Are we looking to a political figure? Are we looking to a technological solution? Or are we looking to the Spirit of God? And so controversially, my third practice, isn't in the book, because there are more than just the 12 practices that we recommend in the book.
Or it may be. Let's see.
So practicing the presence of God, what does it mean to carry an awareness of ask of the Lord is to dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life. So what does it mean all the days of my life, in every circumstance, in every room, in every conversation, to be dwelling in the presence of God? What does it mean for my attention and my focus and my submission to be to Jesus in those moments? What am I doing here, Jesus? What are you doing here, Jesus? How am I serving you today, Jesus? What do you want of me in this space, Jesus? All of the time practicing the presence that Jesus is in front of me, within me, and surrounding me everywhere I go. Because he is the one to bring order. He is the one to speak peace. He is the one to calm the waters around us. So the more aware I am, the more submitted I am, the more in step with his Spirit I am in every moment, the more likely I am to see his ordering power at work in and through me.
Yeah, so in the book, we do talk about worship, and we talked briefly about this beforehand, but we thought it'd be quite good to kind of air it a little. So I suppose for me, I agree with everything you're saying. I agree with practicing the presence, and I might frame it under the rubric of worship. And the two reasons I think it's interesting to kind of do in that way is, if worship is sung, if it's primarily about adoration, then I think we've limited it. The Old Testament word comes from abed, to serve, and so work and worship are actually derived from the same root word. And so all that we do, our work in the broadest sense, and I don't mean a job, I mean our work in caring for parents or children, or yes, the 9 to 5 and the sports club and the weekend and the things and the way we serve in our church, all of those things are our act of worship, our act of service to another person. So it reorientates us towards God and it reorientates us to serve the other. So I do think that reorientation this moment aligns exactly with what you're saying. So it's an ongoing practicing of the presence of Jesus in all these spaces. And I like the way things like ARC, and there are lots of other events doing this, are driving us to think about our everyday lives. I do think there's more space for faith conversations in public now than there was maybe 5 years ago. Like, that event couldn't have happened. And other events like that. Kate Forbes has led the way in sharing her faith politically. Others have done the same. And I think, and I hope there's more space for us to do that. It doesn't necessarily, I am talking about active sharing, but I'm also talking about the way we live our lives, and it's in deep in our conversation, that it's just embedded within that we share more about what it means to follow Jesus. So there's that. And then the worship, I suppose, we wrote in the book, reminds us of the community nature of this in this moment, the more communal aspect. So I love practicing the presence. Sometimes I read somebody like Brother Lawrence, I'm thinking of somebody incredibly holy who's doing this wonderful thing. It, of course, was integrated for him, and it needs to be something we try and do collectively as well and pulling us into those spaces. Because again, the people that we're standing beside in church, our own relatives who are following Jesus have different views on us in nearly half of these issues. The reality is it's so siloed or diversified at this moment. And we're going to have to work really hard to build worshiping communities that can transcend classic boundaries, because those are becoming harsher and harsher and firmer and firmer. And it's almost like, well, if you're not with me on this one issue, I can't break bread with you, is the phrase almost using it. And they mean that literally. And of course, the biblical text tells us the exact opposite. So I love the practicing the presence. I think that is an act of worship, and it's something we can do through all of our lives. And I'm excited again as to how we try and navigate the chaos that we're in, be Chaosity or the perma-crisis. It doesn't really matter what you want to call it. I don't really care. But what I do think we can all agree on is there's a deep, deep level of problem here. It's both personal and it's collective. And therefore, we're trying to respond to that by re-anchoring ourselves into the God story, but into a personal relationship with Jesus and into a worshiping community that helps and shapes and forms us in doing that. And that is becoming ever more challenging, I think, for church leaders of any level who are trying to help the worshiping community to do this together. So it doesn't just become some individual following Jordan Peterson or whoever and think, oh, what are they doing? Going, Anne Hershey-Ellie has talked a bit more about embedding her faith within the local church community and of doing the journey, and some others have too. And I think that's exciting, and we need to hear more of that piece.
Yeah, beautiful. Okay, so that is it for episode 1 of season 6 of Being Human. Just a little shout out. We love hearing the stories. We've been out and about the last few months, catching up with different churches, being in different spaces. I'm constantly being told about different church or small group communities doing the small group series, watching the videos, reading the book, having the conversations. We would love to hear how it's working for you. Any testimonies, any insights, do get in touch at beinghuman@eauk.org. If you would like to ask us any questions or suggest anything that you would like us to cover, how you're listening to the podcast, do keep in touch with us. You can find us on most social media channels. You can find us on YouTube, or as I said, you can email us at beinghuman@eauk.org. And then if you like our content and would like to hear more, if you've just stumbled across us, don't forget to subscribe, check us out on YouTube, and sign up to our regular news updates at beinghumanlens.com. Until next time, take care, God bless, and we'll catch you soon.